the recording as well. So we move to the next slide. That brings us to the focus of this paper, which is how do our planning and permitting processes and practices to operate interregional transmission need to evolve to enable effective identification and deployment of beneficial interregional transmission projects? And how can these be done through collaborative solutions that allow state regulators to meet the needs of their states through interregional projects? To answer this question, we took a twofold approach. First, we conducted a literature review of papers from academia, industry, government, and really poured through a lot of the documents from the regional planning entities themselves. And second, we interviewed experts across the country in the industry, including state regulators, system operators, and transmission developers. And the idea here was to get perspectives from people with direct experience in the interregional transmission planning and permitting and operations space that we may not be able to glean from reports and documents, and really to help highlight the lived experiences of people going through the processes and to understand what was working well and what wasn't. We focused on 3 areas: interregional transmission planning, permitting, and operations. And we thought that these areas were most important because they covered the major stages of interregional transmission project development, from the very beginning, when projects are identified and approved in the planning process, to the middle, when they get sited and permitted, and then at the end, when they're in service and deliver electricity across regions. We then distilled those learnings from our research into barriers within each of these areas and solutions as well. And for the solutions, we grouped them by different actors. And so we looked at solutions that could be implemented by state governments, transmission planning regions, and the federal government to really show how various entities could engage in advancing reform. Before we jump into the details of our study, I just want to quickly recognize some updates from FERC and DOE that impact interregional transmission planning and permitting processes. As our work started last year, several of the barriers and potential solutions that we identified were acknowledged or partially addressed through these reforms. I'm not going to go through all of this, but some highlights include Order 1920, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, established new standards for regional transmission planning, including harmonization of benefit metrics and planning horizons. It also requires transmission providers to file 1 or more different cost allocation methods for any selected transmission solutions. Order 1977, which establishes authority for federal permitting in areas of historical or expected congestion if states deny permits. And then the White House took a course of actions related to federal permitting and financial assistance, including establishing a 2-year timeline for federal permitting. And so each of these orders and actions partially addresses some of the solutions that we identify, but it's going to be really important to monitor progress on each of these policy developments to see how meaningfully it can unlock interregional transmission. So now I'm going to get into some of the challenges and solutions related to planning, permitting, and operations. So as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to planning, Order 1000 requires interregional coordination of transmission planning processes, but it doesn't really require formal interregional planning. And so that means that they're not required to identify interregional transmission needs and solutions to meet those needs. The limited development of interregional transmission planning, I think, can be largely attributed to 3 issues: lack of planning motivators, cost allocation, and planning process misalignment and analysis limitations. And we think that the solutions to these challenges include enhancements to enable planning regions to seek interregional collaboration and improvements to reconcile planning process differences. So when it comes to lack of interregional planning motivators, what we read and heard pretty consistently throughout our interviews is that current transmission planning processes fail to identify forward-looking interregional solutions. Planning motivators could include identifying common transmission needs across regions, which would then create a drive to collaborate. Other types of motivators could be external pressure from stakeholders or regulatory requirements to engage in formal interregional transmission planning. Cost allocation. So this is the process of determining who pays for what portion of new transmission projects. Generally, costs are allocated by estimating the benefits of different projects. Or estimating the benefits that accrue to each region of projects, which makes the benefit methods and calculations behind those methods very heavily scrutinized. And the difficulty with cost allocation has really, I think, contributed to the rise in merchant transmission development. So if you take a look at the map at the top of the slide, this is a view of many of the shovel-ready projects under development today. And you'll note that most of these projects are yellow and green, indicating that they're merchant projects that are planned and paid for outside of interregional planning processes. I think this suggests that existing processes aren't working to identify and allocate the costs of beneficial interregional transmission. And finally, there are misalignments in planning processes and limitations to how analyses are conducted between regions. And it's not that surprising because, that processes are different because they were developed for their own regions on their own timelines. But this misalignment does present itself in the analysis methods themselves, like data, benefit metrics, planning horizons, modeling tools, et cetera, as well as in the process timelines themselves. So if we go to the next slide, thanks. This is an example if you compare MISO and PJM's processes, specifically MISO's LRTP and PJM's market efficiency, which are both of the region's most long-range planning processes. And so you'll see misalignment in both the process and timelines. The table here is just a snippet of a much longer table that we have in the report, which compares LRTP and market efficiency processes. And you can see that they consider different types of benefits and have different benefit calculation methods. So differences between these two processes can make it difficult to collaborate on planning for interregional projects, because projects that may be beneficial under one region's methodology may not be under another region's, or the magnitude of estimated benefits just may be very different across the two regions, which could lead to difficult cost allocation questions. Order 1920 addresses some of these challenges, like requiring a standard set of benefits to be considered. But again, it'll take some time to see how that plays out. If you go to the next slide. But even if we sort of are able to reconcile all of the process discrepancies, there's still often a natural misalignment between the region's planning timelines. So the snapshot here is of MISO and PJM's planning process timelines. And what you can see is that they're not aligned, which is actually pretty common for most neighboring regions. And this misalignment makes it difficult for regions to collaborate on projects and iterate on projects. And it often makes it really hard for a project to be evaluated in a reasonable amount of time across planning regions. And this has implications for project development and financing. And so when we get to planning solutions, this is an overview of all of the solutions that we suggest for addressing planning challenges, as well as areas for state and federal engagement. I'm going to touch on the first two today. So if you go to the next slide. So the first is coordinated interregional transmission planning. And so what we mean here is that planning regions could expand coordination to determine joint transmission needs and really identify interregional transmission solutions. So if you establish a joint need, that itself becomes a planning motivator, and it helps to really jumpstart the process. Regions can then be motivated to reconcile any differences that they have in their planning processes, or even potentially develop new ones to identify interregional projects that meet those needs more cost effectively than their regional alternatives. I think a really good example of this is the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue Study, JTIQ, which was initiated by the MISO and SPP planning regions in 2020 after identifying a planning motivator, which was expensive incremental upgrades that were required for generator interconnection at the seam of the two markets. This led MISO and SPP to take pretty, unprecedented step of collaborating to study network upgrades at their market seams that would be more cost effective than the upgrades that they identified in their respective regional processes. There was a joint need that motivated the planning here, and we think that this could be replicated as well in other regions. And the motivation could come from the planning regions themselves, from state influence, or through other sort of federal requirements or incentives. I think another good example of this type of coordinated interregional planning is the West Tech effort in the Western Interconnection. It's sponsored by the Western Power Pool, but was really born out of a recognition that more holistic interconnection-wide planning was needed to meet the needs of the future grid. It's in early days, and it's a voluntary effort, but I think it includes many of the elements of successful planning coordination, including broad participation of stakeholders outside of just transmission owners in developing the scope, governance, and technical analysis of the effort. And so I think that will also be a good process to follow as it develops further. The next solution that we talk about is planning methods harmonization. And so here we think that regions could standardize universal best practices in regional and interregional transmission planning. Harmonizing planning approaches and timelines is one way to do this. And we think that could enable more efficient interregional collaboration and allow projects to avoid delays due to asynchronous planning timelines. And we think that FERC Order 1920 addresses some of this misalignment by standardizing a minimum set of benefit metrics and inclusion of a 20-year planning horizon. But again, this only addresses some of the misalignment. When it comes to areas, oh, can you go back? When it comes to areas of state and federal engagement, there, I think, are some important places for engagement. States are some of the most influential stakeholders in transmission planning venues, and because transmission permitting falls within the jurisdiction of states for most projects, the best laid transmission plans may not actually come to fruition if states aren't on board. So this was a theme that was really underscored throughout our interviews, and it's really and we heard consistently that it's really important to have state engagement in the planning process, particularly during the needs identification stage. If regional planners know what states need, they can be better equipped to find the planning motivators that can support interregional transmission development. I think there's also really good examples of state engagement in recent history that highlight the value of including states. One example is actually a project that we worked on recently, which is the Clean Resilience Link project, which is a set of coordinated upgrades of lines that make up the New York-New England intertie. And that project is born out of an asset condition need on the New England side, and through study work showed that there were greater benefits to the region if the interface was completely or more comprehensively upgraded. And so that prompted a cooperative effort between the two regions to quantify potential benefits. This project serves not only the asset condition need, but it also supports the achievement of policy goals, clean energy goals for the Northeast region. And this multi-state collaborative effort, I think, really illustrates the ability for states to guide interregional transmission solution identification to meet multiple needs, which may not be captured through traditional planning pathways. Another piece that supported this motivation for planning was the availability of financial support through federal incentives, which definitely helped to catalyze action from the states. When it comes to permitting, what we mean here is the process of deciding whether a project is in the public interest and issuing permits that codifies that approval, such as through a CPCN or a CCN, which is generally in most states done by state regulators. Regulators typically have the final decision over which projects are built because permitting comes towards the end of a project's development process. We heard that we've seen permitting processes pose pretty significant barriers to building beneficial interregional transmission projects. And these challenges come from limited resources at permitting agencies, differences between different states' permitting processes, and difficulties in meeting permitting criteria across every state through which an interregional project crosses. Most permitting approvals require justification of the necessity of the transmission project, and this often requires an assessment of the project's benefit and costs. This can sometimes be seen as duplicative for projects that have already obtained approval through a regional transmission planning process, and can sometimes be seen as taking another bite at the apple for issues that were maybe already addressed during planning. Or, on the other hand, it could introduce new questions related to need that weren't in scope during the planning process. Iterating on these issues of need can often lead to delays or even denials, and both of these types of outcomes are not ideal, and I think highlight the challenges of replicated need determinations in planning and permitting. State permitting entities are also pretty limited in their ability to participate in transmission planning and analysis. We heard pretty consistently that permitting entities are understaffed, they're underfunded, and their staff are spread thin across many different regulatory responsibilities. So if they're unable to participate in the transmission planning process, they may not be able to actually advocate for the needs to be reflected in the proposed projects, or even take some time to discuss local siting challenges. Another challenge that we heard pretty consistently was pass-through communities and states. And this came up because planners identify projects that can provide benefits across a broad region, while state permitting entities really only assess the net impacts to ratepayers within their states. And our research highlighted that these different perspectives really come to a head when states or communities that host transmission, that host a transmission project may not receive the benefits associated with that project. And sometimes states may also perceive that they are being impacted to enable another state's energy priorities. So if we go to the next slide, this is an example of a pass-through community challenge, and this is illustrated by the Missouri PSC's initial denial of permits for the Grain Belt Express project. So the project is meant to deliver Kansas wind to customers in Missouri, Illinois, and other parts of the Midwest. And as you can see, it crosses multiple regional boundaries, and it requires permits in each of the states that it spans. The initial permit application hinged on both Missouri meeting wind targets and aiding the delivery of wind to load centers east of Missouri. There was also a lot of pushback from landowners within Missouri in the original permitting hearing as well. This led to an initial permit denial, as the PSC thought the consideration should be primarily on the effects to Missouri utilities and customers rather than entities outside of the state. It was only after the Grain Belt Express project was able to add loads in Missouri and compensate landowners at 150% of market rate that the project was able to successfully get a permit in the state. And I think it was maybe 5 years between the initial denial and ultimate approval, which also shows how long these processes can take. We do think there are a number of solutions that could address the permitting challenges we outlined, though, and an overarching theme of these solutions is to bolster state capabilities to assess transmission benefits and evaluate transmission projects. We think that this can enable more streamlined permitting decisions and really empower states to anticipate and advocate for their needs for transmission and regional processes. And the solutions we list here are designed to help achieve these types of permitting improvements. And so the first is developing state transmission authorities through state or maybe even federal funding to engage in transmission planning activities, analyze transmission needs, provide siting guidance to developers, or even participate in or fund transmission development more directly. Several states have established these types of authorities, and their roles and responsibilities differ, but examples of roles include engaging directly in planning activities, identifying intra or interstate transmission corridors, and helping to finance projects through things like issuing bonds. An example of one of these state transmission authorities is New Mexico's Renewable Energy Transmission Authority. It was established by the New Mexico legislature in 2007, and its purpose is to plan, finance, develop, and acquire high voltage transmission lines in New Mexico. In addition to directly investing in these projects that advance state interests, they also support on-the-ground activities like providing balanced oversight when developers are acquiring rights of way. So this allows landowners to receive, at a minimum, fair market rate compensation for their land and ensures that the developer can get their project built. This can really help to reduce the time for a project to get developed because demonstrating rights of way is often a pretty critical part to obtaining a permit. The second, right, thanks. The second solution that we have listed here is host community benefits. And this is meant to provide non-energy benefits to host communities to ensure that states or communities that bear the physical impact of a project also receive their benefits. And so this could be through things like compensation in the form of project equity, direct financial payments, or investments in the community like schools or roads. And this is actually, pretty standard practice in renewable development in our industry today through things like community benefit agreements. And so we think that this could be something that could also be more standardized for interregional transmission. An example of this is NYSERDA's Tier 4 REC procurement, which sought to procure RECs from projects that use long-range transmission to provide zero-carbon energy to New York City. NYSERDA's evaluation criteria, I think it weighted 10% of the bid evaluation to a category that they called incremental economic benefits plan. And it required the proposals to detail plans for things like job creation and workforce development and investment in non-transmission infrastructure. So clarifying the intent to evaluate these sorts of non-traditional transmission benefits, I think, can really prompt developers to provide these community benefits and work with the host communities to address the physical and financial impacts of the interregional projects that may be coming through their communities. And so through their Tier 4 solicitation, NYSERDA selected 2 transmission projects, Clean Path and Chippy, which promised to provide, I think, close to $500 million of community investment funds, in addition to thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in economic development investments. Another interesting thing is that Chippy is also co-owned by one of its host communities, a Canadian First Nation, which also shows that, potentially providing project equity to these host communities could be beneficial. The 2 other solutions here are really focused on streamlining the permitting process by utilizing the same analysis used in planning approval for permitting approval same analysis used for in planning approval for permitting approval, and trying to coordinate evidentiary hearings across multiple states so that they could, to the best of their ability, synchronize permitting timelines and ensure that the same type of information is being shared across all of the regulatory bodies. We don't have time to go into these in detail on today's call, so I'd encourage you to read the paper to learn more about these. I think we have some good examples in there. So where there can be engagement in the state and federal level is we think that states can communicate their needs early in the transmission planning process. Again, I think this ensures that projects that meet the needs are the ones that move on to permitting. And it also provides the planning context for a project that can be useful to regulators when they're contemplating permitting decisions. When it comes to the federal government, we think that there is the ability for them to support state-led permitting enhancements through funding of training for staff who are supporting permitting. Like I mentioned, we heard that state permitting processes have really limited staff support, and so building out this funding could help. Funding could also support the development of the transmission authorities. And should states lag or really not make progress on their permitting approvals, there is the potential for the federal government to step in to close any permitting gaps. And an example of this is Order 1977, which did clarify that FERC has backstop authority to issue permits in national corridors if states deny siting applications. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jack next to discuss operations.
Thanks, Lakshmi. The final operations is really the final area that we wanted to look into for this work, because we think that it's really important to consider not only what transmission you have, but how you use it, both in terms of the existing transmission, the interregional transmission that connects markets today, as well as any new projects that are built under the planning that Lakshmi talked about before. Within this, overall, looking at actual operations and a review and discussion with different areas and review of literature, it's surprising at times how low the utilization is often on existing transmission lines. And we've found a couple of areas and factors that sort of cause that limitation. I think the first is that in many places there are transaction charges or some kind of economic limit that, or for scheduling, that reduces different market participants on either side of the market's willingness to trade between the different markets. And so this sort of promotes, from an economic standpoint, more of an inward look, and it adds essentially to the marginal cost of making an exchange, sort of what's termed in the industry a hurdle rate, or an additional cost that sort of has to be gotten over to really make an interregional transfer of energy worth it to the market participant there. Secondly, there's a factor that's sometimes referred to as latency, which is essentially that interregional schedules between different markets typically need to be put in place at a time period that is, and sort of set and locked in at a time period that's before either of the markets actually run. So typically, particularly if we're talking in real-time operations, there'll be 5-minute intervals that are going, and different market participants inside each region are making bids within their own regions. But for interregional schedules, the timeline often is backed up from that for the market to have that information. And we'll get into a little bit more detail about that. But I think the result of that is that longer advance time requirement creates more risk for a market participant in either of the markets to make a decision to make a transfer from one market to the other, as compared to making bids into one's own local market. And finally, there is a greater amount of uncertainty for interregional transactions typically. So, just a recognition on either side, particularly by load entities, that there could be things that could cause schedules between the regions to get cut, perhaps at a sort of earlier prioritization level than something internally, can make more risk-averse sort of reliability focused entities on either side favor choices that are sort of within their own region rather than looking for procuring power outside of the region. So I think digging into this a little bit more, this is a chart that we put together that both shows the actual interchange as reported by EIA on an 8760 basis. So sort of all across the year on interregional exchanges in terms of megawatts of power for each hour between these different markets, where positive is sort of the positive direction flow. So if you have the upper left, you have PJM flow to MISO. And the dotted lines show in the recent DOE interregional transmission report, transmission needs report, they had an estimate for what the existing intertie capacity was between these lines. And so the thing that really stands out to us in this is how many hours existing lines actually are not getting used at or near the limit of their total capability. And I think that this really informs and sort of is an important relevant fact to consider when thinking about proposals such as a minimum transfer capability limit that some people have that would be sort of a generic minimum about the total capacity that's between a line, between different regions. Because really, I think it shows two things looking at actual utilization. One is that not all transmission lines and not all capacity is sort of equivalent to itself. So some could be in better locations than others. And secondly, that practices for how trades are made between regions are really important for getting the most out of the investments that are made for building that new capacity. So again, I think this highlights to us that this is a really important issue to consider alongside planning and permitting issues when thinking about interregional transmission. I think both because it gives you the most value of what you build, as well as it sort of informs what you anticipate the value you would get from future lines would be. So looking at solutions, if we go to the next slide, we've dug into a sort of a range of solutions that we wanted to highlight here, which we list overall, which includes things like reducing the transaction charges between zones and between markets, which there's been some progress in certain seams, but I think still could be an area of improvement in other regions. I think the other would be reducing that time lag of sort of how long in advance schedules have to be made in different markets. And then finally, two that we really want to dig into. One is actually developing the sort of optimized interregional transmission scheduling mechanism. So typically between markets now, there's something called a coordinated transfer schedule that essentially sort of ahead of time has, basically causes participants in either market to put in what they're going to have and what they're going to trade for either of these markets. But it can cause the ahead of time aspect of that can cause some uncertainty and sort of willingness to be sort of underutilized. And so there's a couple of other mechanisms, one in Europe and then one that's being employed in the West, in the Western interconnection, to essentially have not just a single bid going into either market, but rather more visibility into the nature of the supply on either side of a market seam. The picture that we're showing here is the expansion of the energy imbalance market. And it works particularly well in a situation where you have one organized market and then adjacent regions that don't have a formal market, but rather are more traditional vertically integrated utility regions that can sort of bid into and with sort of more visibility into the adjacent market, like CalISO in this case. Separately, INSO-E, the European market operator, is looking at flow-based market coupling and single intraday coupling, which are different platforms and mechanisms to allow more 15-minute trading between the markets and enhance sort of what people have the ability to do sort of on short notice, which reduces that risk and uncertainty involved. The final thing I'd like to just hit on the operations side, I think on the next slide, is the potential for improving preparations for resiliency. I think in terms of utilizing the transmission that we have, sometimes we have success stories where sort of market operators really were able to respond quickly and make good decisions kind of on the fly. I think with Uri, I've heard good descriptions of sort of MISO helping SPP, SPP helping MISO, and then MISO helping PJM sort of as the storm moved west to east. But I think that could be promoted more on a non-ad hoc basis, sort of emergency conditions, but rather something that people could prepare for and drill more for with greater effort. So I think the states and federal government, I think, can engage in this in various ways. I think both encouragement to the different regions that they should really prioritize this interregional operations, I think, is important to continue to mention. I think as well on the federal side, and analytical guidance they can have for methodologies that might work well as at a FERC level, a willingness or a flexibility to be open to new mechanisms that might promote more interregional transmission utilization and sort of improved operations, as well as at a federal level. I think finally, sort of convening technical forums to really think about that preparation for resiliency conditions and how different regions can help out each other to make the most of sort of the back pocket of having your neighbors around to support you. So that rounds up the operations side. I think I just wanted to turn it back to Lakshmi to finish things off as a summary.
Thanks, Jack. So this is a summary of all of the solutions that we discussed in the paper, and some of which we were able to discuss in detail today. Others are outlined in more detail in the paper. But if we look at this, I think there are a couple of key takeaways for me. First is that there is a lot of opportunity to improve each phase of the interregional transmission lifecycle. First, we see opportunity and I guess alongside that, we see many solutions that can be pursued by states and planning regions. This is really underpinned, though, by enhanced communication and collaboration across and between states and planning regions. We think that has really been key to the examples of successful interregional transmission planning that we've seen to date. And there's also a really important role for the federal government to provide guidance and funding to support these states and planning region-led efforts, and potentially act as a provider of last resort if the planning regions and states fail to make progress on their own. So in conclusion, while planning and permitting and operating interregional transmission to maximize system benefits is challenging, we think it's really imperative that we take steps to enable the identification of beneficial interregional transmission through the planning process, allow for those projects to be evaluated and accurately valued during the permitting process, and operate those projects to maximize system benefits when they're put into service. If we don't do that, I think we risk creating a more expensive grid that has more frequent reliability events. So the top areas we think require focus include a collaborative approach to interregional transmission planning that is proactive, that really enables joint identification of transmission needs, and has coordinated or even combined analysis of solutions across planning regions. State engagement in regional and interregional transmission planning processes is really critical to ensuring that state needs are represented in planning, which can then help support permitting processes for any projects that are selected to move on to permitting. We also think that exploration of the development of new state agencies dedicated to transmission development, such as state transmission authorities, could be really helpful to have state level support and expertise. And then improvements to intertie utilization through many of the solutions that Jack just talked about, and opportunities for the federal support to enhance state and planning-led solutions. And this could be through funding, identifying gaps in planning across regions, even developing best practices for interregional planning, permitting, and operations. And I think hosting forums that can convene stakeholders for capacity building. So I'll pause there. I know that we went through a lot of material just now, so I'll see if there are any questions or feedback.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi and Jack and the rest of you. I'm very pleased that I can introduce Chair Andrew French from the Kansas Corporation Commission, who has been involved in this work through our transmission working group. We appreciate that he's here and given the busy schedules. I'm going to let Chair French moderate some of the Q&A. We've got a couple that have come in so far. So I will pass it off to you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I am here. As alluded to, I was late, but I'm here. So good to see you all. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's fantastic. As Jeff reminded everybody, you can add questions through the Q&A. I don't know if we have the ability to unmute people, but I can certainly pass along the questions in the Q&A. I've got some questions, but I want to start off with the ones that have been submitted here. So the first question we've got is on cost allocation. Anonymous attendee asks that they posit that cost allocation is the biggest barrier, and want to know if you could just go a little deeper on maybe how that's being mitigated in different circumstances.
I could take that to start, if that's okay. I actually wouldn't describe cost allocation as the biggest barrier here. And I think that's one of the things that we really found is that there's a lot of these process reasons that really slow down the system that, people can kind of get distracted by cost allocation being the hurdle that you have to face and sort of miss that it's sort of 1,000 cuts in a lot of different areas that really slow down the process. I think the other thing is with cost allocation, it's actually a potential solution if you think about the fact that different people have different types of benefits. And so ideally, if you could allocate cost proportional to that, that could sort of help broker find sort of what would be otherwise a good negotiated outcome. I think, though, in terms of how to mitigate that, I think one of the things that we really find is that a good starting point here is really first, really having a common basis for describing how each side or each of the states or regions value the different projects that we're looking at. And I think one distinction that we make in the paper, which I think is worthwhile to mention, is that not everyone will have the same values. Different states, are not all equal, and some might, have a different prioritization of carbon reductions or a different prioritization of local job growth. And I think that's perfectly reasonable to have. I think what it's important to have commonality around is what the facts are. And so the more that you can have sort of coordination of, the methodologies that you go about for how to calculate any of these, as well as what the underlying sort of data that go into it are, that's really important.
Yeah, and maybe one thing I'll add to that, Jack, is I think, the thing that we heard very consistently is to have states central to the process from the very beginning. And so that the earlier that they are involved, that helps with identifying their needs. And so that the projects that come through to cost allocation are hopefully better aligned with what they're looking for, which then I think enables more buy-in to cost allocation discussions, which is also pretty critical because any projects that make it past cost allocation then have to go under permitting. And so, the states are then going to have a chance to also have any sort of discussions around need in the permitting process. And so it's really important to have sort of that participation early in the process.
Great. A lot of good information there. We've got another question in the chat from our friend Sarah Fitzpatrick. She's still everybody's friend, even though she's not at NARUC anymore, with North Carolina now. Sarah, I'll go ahead and read your question. I do think we have the ability to take you off mute if I get anything wrong here, though. Sarah writes, are there examples, formal or informal, that you saw in your research and interviews of operators coming together to address some of the interregional barriers? For example, reducing the time before interregional transactions are scheduled, coordinating planning timelines, etc.
Jack, is there anything in the operations that you want to?
Definitely on the operations side, there's been different examples. For instance, New York and New England have decided to waive some of the transaction charges they used to impose on transfers between the regions, and they sort of see that as sort of a mutually beneficial approach to doing things. As well as sort of the example of in the West that we had of that sort of same process happens within the energy imbalance market. Whereas there's normally OAT rates or other charges that go for transfers between Arizona and California, for instance. During the EIN, they sort of have this idea of reciprocity where each side is using the transmission that otherwise would sort of go underutilized within them.
From a transmission planning timelines perspective, I think one example we saw in the West was the West-wide Transmission Planning Forum, or the forum in which proposed interregional solutions come to the table, is well aligned with how CAISO timelines, the California ISO, are bringing in potential solutions to meet their regional transmission needs. And so we get that kind of alignment of the project comes in to the interregional forum at the same time as the Cal ISO is beginning to assess potential solutions. And so there's a natural kind of synchronization there. It hasn't necessarily led to a lot of interregional transmission solutions being approved and borne out and cost allocated in the West, but it's an example of that kind of intentional timeline synchronization.
Yeah, I would also add MISO and PJM are putting increasing effort into looking into ways to coordinate their planning between them.
Yeah, and the I guess the other one you guys did mention was the JTIQ between SPP and MISO, and that seems like another time where they, their affected system studies weren't matching up, or identifying problematic projects, and they just decided to set all of their existing planning processes aside and come up with something flexible. So that's another example you all pointed out. Well, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. Oh, here we go. My good friend Riley Allen has saved the day. Riley asks, how far did FERC Order 1920 go toward providing solutions? What did they leave on the table to create a more proactive, holistic, long-term planning framework between regions?
Yeah, so I can start. I think that FERC Order 1920 does a fair amount to start to harmonize the regional planning processes. It has a standard set of 7 minimum benefits that has to be considered and some optional benefits on top of that. It also creates, some additional sort of planning best practices and planning standards. It goes out 20 years, and sort of it has like long range transmission planning that's included. It doesn't, I'd say, explicitly change anything related to interregional planning outside of, incorporating these changes into the regional processes. And so there is no sort of requirement for formal interregional planning to the extent that we're talking about today. So I do think that is left on the table and is something that, could be considered going forward.
Thank you. Not seeing any more questions. I'm going to ask one of my own, which probably could take us to the end of the hour here. I was really glad to see all the discussion and quantifications of the operations side. Jack, I thought that section was really helpful, particularly helping me understand how much interregional transfer capability is underutilized today. This is anecdotal. I come from the SPP MISO interchange, and I think, you know, what we observe is that those two regions actually have a really robust ability to flow power back and forth, but it isn't used by and large for the reasons that you've mentioned: hurdle rates, and the, you know, sort of inability to schedule economic transactions. And so, you know, as I'm looking at this, I guess I'm wondering, this is a leading question, but you know, would you say that some of those operational items, getting the, you know, the markets to talk to each other better, or scheduling fixed, is that something that needs to come first before we start planning and cost allocating these lines? Because that's going to help you set up sort of what the value proposition is, and how the benefits are going to be spread. If you can start to see how that interregional transfer capability is used on a day-to-day basis. You know, right now, seems like it's basically just used during extreme events, and it works fine then, but it's not really used day to day. So it's hard to understand, you know, who's going to benefit from those projects. So in order of operations, you know, am I thinking logically to think that maybe some of those operational changes maybe need to come first before we can do some of the other things?
Yeah, I mean, I would first say that it really does sort of muddle the argument for interregional transmission if you just look at existing utilization. You know, kind of, at least me, when I saw it, I kind of backed up. I was like, well, gosh, like, what about all the stuff that we already have? Which I asked myself, you know, I think that it is important to prioritize, and I think it doesn't get talked about enough is the first thing is on the operational side. That said, I don't think that it's sort of needs to be queued before other planning issues are addressed, primarily because it really depends a lot on what the types of benefits or nature of benefits that we're looking at for particular lines are, especially if we're looking at a situation where you have a line that's largely built to bring resources from one sort of resource rich area or rich in a particular type of resources to another region. Those can often move forward because they're driven by something that's not just sort of how is operations and diversity working sort of in the short term. And that's probably been the bigger driver highlighted for, you know, new build of transmission than existing. But at the same time, when you think about, you know, that type of line or any other line, usually, you know, it's important to think, okay, well, it has that direct benefit, but it also has sort of a wider set of benefits. And to really get that wider set in, it's, you know, I think operations is important to think through.
Yeah, and it seems like maybe that's why we're seeing more just DC lines right now, is that's the kind of build that addresses the issue you're talking about, where if you really want these robust AC connections, it seems like those are the ones where the operational issues maybe are more relevant.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I would add there too is that all of these solutions are going to take some time. And so I think it's important to get started on all of them in, you know, in parallel to some degree. And I think the more that we start to learn from better reforms and operations, that can help inform the other pieces as well.
Well, great. Well, we've come to almost noon. I saw we get one more question in here. It's not a question. They just wanted to tell you they love the presentation. So great feedback. I don't see any more questions, and we are at noon. So I think we can conclude here. Let me just thank you all again. This is a fantastic presentation. There is a lot in here that we could drill down on, you know, in the coming months. I mean, and get much more granular on some of this, but it's a lot of takeaways that we can take back to our regions and work on. So I'll give you some applause and thank you for the presentation. And we hope to be working with you in the future on this. And I'll turn it back to Jeff. Jeff, is there anything else?
No, I think you covered it, Chairman. Thank you for moderating, and thanks to E3. And I've posted the link to the publication again. And of course, you'll be able to find that on our website. So I hope if you get a chance to thank E3 in person and when you run across them any place, you'll do that. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right. Thank you all. Take care.
Yeah. Thanks to the NARUC team too.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care.